Morning, afternoon, good evening, good night. Mike the Inspirer is with us once again.
How are you doing, my good sir?
I'm doing good. How are you doing?
Pretty good. Can't complain. Uh, so, in case people missed our first interview and they don't know who you are, would you like to tell the audience a bit about yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Michael Jones. I run the Inspiring Philosophy YouTube channel. Basically, I'm a Christian apologist. Currently in school to get my master's in philosophy, where I'm basically on my channel. I post videos defending Christianity, defending a theistic worldview, and whatnot.
Uh, so, since you're getting a master's degree, will you go up and get a PhD in it?
Maybe eventually, but right now I'm too exhausted after this. I'm getting behind on videos, so I'll probably take a break. And if I decide, I'll probably get a PhD in biblical studies. But that's years down the road. Right now, I just want to get the master's and get back to work.
All right, that's fair enough. So, in this interview, the last interview we had was more of a general discussion. We went over some projects you did before. In this one, we're going to be a little bit more specific because this will be on virtue ethics.
Right.
And maybe we'll have some other questions up that my friend here might want to ask you.
And to start off, does the power of Christ compel you?
What does that mean?
Does the power of Christ compel you, bro?
Yes, then.
We have a sort of a running gag we started where we started asking Christians that question. It's a reference to The Exorcist.
Obviously.
Right.
Where the priest says, to the demon possessed girl, does the power of Christ compel you?
Yeah, but it doesn't compel you in general to do worship the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, but you worship God with your mind.
Correct, but I would say I worship God with all my heart, soul, and mind as well.
Yeah. But yeah, anyway, we're going to be going over virtue ethics, and would you like to tell the audience, give a little rundown on virtue ethics as you see it?
Yeah, so virtue ethics is one of the major fields of normative ethics. The other two major fields would be consequentialism and deontology, and there's other minor views as well. But virtue ethics is sort of different from a lot of other modern ethical views, which focus on right action. So some ethical views, like consequentialism, say the right action should be if it produces a good consequence. A deontologist would say the right action should be if we're following universal moral rules. So there's certain laws tell us what to do, we have to follow those universal moral laws. Virtue ethics is a little bit different because it says these views of ethics are not wrong per se. They're just incomplete. They're not really capturing the whole picture. And ethics is much broader than that. So really, so what virtue ethics argues is that we should be focusing more on the whole character of an individual. So instead of worrying about just right actions, we should also focus on the overall person. Are they living a virtuous life? Are they living a flourishing life? Do they have the right emotions? Do they have the right motives? And once you have that figured out, then the right actions will flow naturally from that. So don't worry about right actions. Focus on the virtuous character. And I can give an analogy to try to help this. So let's say a politician passes a law that somehow helps kids get medical treatment. Both sides of the aisle agree the law is beneficial, it works, it gets kids medical treatment. They praise the politician for coming up with this idea and passing it. But let's say about a year later, we found out that the politician was involved, or there was emails that surfaced that revealed the politician saying things like, I don't care if it helps kids, they mean nothing to me. I'm a shareholder in a medical supply company, and I'm going to get rich from this law. Could we say that he did the right thing? Maybe, but we would still look at him as a bad person because his character was not right. He was doing it for the wrong motives. Now, if deontology is a true form of ethics, that doesn't matter. What really matters is that he did the right thing. Now, deontologists can respond to that by ushering in a couple extra assumptions in there that he's going to have like the right motives and whatnot, but it seems just sort of additional aspects on it that sort of get to what the virtue ethicist wants to get to. That ethics is more than just right actions. It's about having an overall good, virtuous character.
Yeah. I like to use the old classic example, like it has a historical basis to it. It's the case of the racist abolitionist. Basically, this is historical reality, there were abolitionists that really did not intrinsically care about racism against black people. They were racist themselves, but they supported abolition because they felt slavery was taking all the poor white men's jobs, and they felt that other economies that had done away with slavery were doing much better. And so they supported, abolishing slavery purely on a selfish motive.
Yeah, that's a good example as well, because that actually did happen in the United States, especially I believe in Kansas when that was becoming a state. A lot of Northerners were moving there to vote against it becoming a slave state, but their motive was, we'll get better farming treatment and we'll make more money.
Yeah, so consequentialists would say that a racist abolitionist, since he fought to end slavery, that makes his actions good.
Right, and we would agree his actions are good, but we would also say that that's not the whole picture of ethics. That doesn't mean he's a good person. So I don't think on virtue ethics I would say that deontology or consequentialism are wrong. There are good aspects, a part of those views of ethics. What I, as a virtue ethicist, would say is that they're incomplete. You're not capturing fully what ethics is, and there needs to be more there.
I mean, what I like to say and give an example is like, Massimo Paolucci is also a philosopher, and he went over this in some of his blog posts where he said all ethical theories, involve consequences, and they involve some principles. The differences between them are more or less where we're going to place them, or how much role do they play. Like, for example, a virtue ethicist would say knowing the consequences of your actions is irrelevant. Like, a virtue ethicist wouldn't say it, because a virtuous person, I would think, would be cautious in making sure that their actions are having some good.
Yeah, I think well, that's the thing, is that virtue ethics doesn't ignore the importance of actions. It's a very important aspect of ethics, is knowing when to do the right thing and whatnot. But that's not all ethics is, and also it's about the right placement of actions. So should laws and guiding actions be the basis of ethics? A virtue ethicist would say no, that the basis of ethics, the foundation needs to be what a virtuous character is. What is it like to live as a virtuous agent? And when you figure that out, right actions will just naturally flow from you. You don't have to worry about what's the right thing to do in this situation. Do I need to be silent? Do I need to act? You'll just naturally do what is right if you become a virtuous agent. So, as Aristotle said, you'll become a law unto yourself. You won't have to worry about laws telling you what to do. You'll just do the right thing. Julia Annis compares virtues to practical skills. And I think this is a great analogy, because let's say you have the practical skill of cooking. A professional cook can be put in the kitchen and be given ingredients and know what to make something without a recipe. He doesn't need to be given instructions. He just has the skill of cooking. Likewise, if you just have the virtue of kindness, you'll know when to apply it. You'll know how to apply it. You'll know how to act kindly. You won't have to worry about, well, wait a minute, is there some sort of law I have to follow? What's the right thing to do here? You'll just know when to be kind. So Annis compares virtues to practical skills and says they're sort of like them. But once you have the virtue of kindness or gentleness, you'll know how to apply them properly. Much like if you have a practical skill, you'll know how to just act in a situation when the skill is called for.
There are all different types of virtue ethics. There is the atomist virtue ethics. There's more agent-based. There's target-based, and there's the Platonist virtue ethics. Where do you think you fall more into those categories?
Well, see, here's the thing. I wouldn't say I fall into those categories. I would, what I'm going to do in an upcoming video, probably won't get to it till December, but I'm going to argue that Christianity has its own form of virtue ethics, and that's the ethics I would fall into. So specifically, I'm a virtue ethicist, and I would say I hold to Christian virtue ethics. So it's slightly different than what Aristotle would have laid out. It's slightly different than modern forms of ethics, but there are similarities. So I would say I'm a Christian virtue ethicist holding to the ethics of the New Testament, the virtue ethics of the New Testament.
That's pretty good. So, you got a question you'd like to ask him to, Carlos, in regards to this?
You ask your own, then I'll ask mine.
All right, that's fair enough. So, the first question I ask is, this comes from reflection upon, reading Ed Fazer's works. The first question I have is, would you say that there are certain virtues that Yahweh can't have?
Yeah, I would be okay with saying that. I mean, there are certain things just God can't do, like get sick or die or cease to exist in that sort of sense. So yeah, I would say it's something like the virtue of bravery. Bravery means you have some sort of fear, some sort of thing you have to overcome, and you have to sort of stand up to it. Well, that's not going to apply to an omnipotent being who has more power than anything else in existence. He doesn't have to be brave in that sense. So yeah, I would say there are certain things God cannot do, or certain virtues God cannot have, based on his circumstances in his ontology.
Yeah, and a lot of times in virtue ethics, I found that a key moderating principle that goes into it is the principle of justice, where, for example, bravery is not just in virtue ethics, at least from what I've read. It isn't, just doing, acting, against, acting in the face of danger. That's not really what bravery, at least that's Aristotle defined it. Aristotle defined it as more acting justly in the face of danger, not just acting in the face of danger.
Mm-hmm.
Because they gave an example. Let's say you have a gang of marauders who are going to coming to your village, and and what you do is you just run out there with your sword, and you charge these dozens of people. Well, people would say that's brave, but Aristotle would disagree and say that's stupid. You have no realistic chance of doing anything.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe one person.
Yeah, I mean, obviously virtues are more than just actions or doing certain things. I mean, it's about having a proper character, knowing when to act. I mean, sometimes the brave thing to do is to do nothing.
Well, yeah, I mean, Aristotle, at least in his example, he said the brave thing to do in that case would be to gather up the people in your village and try to form I would say a militia, so that way you'd have the best chance of fighting against the marauders.
Correct,
Just being first into battle is not bravery, it's stupidity.
Yeah, it was more than just certain actions. I mean, but that's just the nature of virtue. It's about having the right skill. So you got to make sure you understand what the skill is, so to speak, or in this case, what the virtue is and what it calls for. So you can think of like the virtue of kindness. It's not always being kind. If there's a spoiled child, sometimes you have to apply what we would call tough love. And so you got to be sort of mean to them. You got to get them up on their feet, get them to understand they have to just, become their own person, so to speak, and not just keep relying on everybody else.
It's also with the woke people today. You just gotta stop to not. What would be the kind thing to do is to not feed their delusions and just be blunt about it.
Correct.
Yeah. But another thing I would also say that that Yahweh at least could not have would be, I would say in a sense, piety or some sort of celibacy. That'd be one. Let's see, is I would say that's something Yahweh can't have because, Yahweh doesn't have a physical body.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you word it like that, that's different. It just really depends on what you mean.
Yeah. Well, I mean, celibacy is like, abstaining from sex and more like self-restraint. Well, God doesn't have to be self-restraint.
Mm-hmm.
He's all powerful. He can't really self-restrain himself from what he is.
All it had the self-restraint not to destroy the Israelites.
And also, now that we got onto that, I've noticed that, you did come out with a video talking about Moses and the Mosaic Law.
Yeah.
And you went over in fine detail works from biblical scholars that point out the educational nature of the scriptures and that they weren't prescribing a sort of what we would call like modern penal code into their system.
Yeah, they weren't really doing ethics, but you can see some similarities to the basics of virtue ethics in the Mosaic Code. So it's pre-Aristotelian, so it's not, the Mosaic Law is not a form of ethics, but it's also not deontology. So a lot of people read the Mosaic Law and they hear things like, kill a witch, kill someone who works on the Sabbath, and they go, well, these are some sort of moral laws that were given by God. It's not really what's going on. Scholars like John Walton, Jean Bottero will say that this is more about didactic nature. This is wisdom teachings. They're more akin to proverbs in this sense. So I detail it more extensively in that video, but what they're basically doing is they're laying out certain teachings within their cultural context on how to glorify and be loyal vassals to Yahweh. And so this is sort of wisdom on sort of how to live. But these stipulations of the covenant between them are not always practical. You're not going to kill literally everyone you come across. That would just be impractical. Dilbert Hillers notes that courts were given a lot of leniency to decide these type of things. They wouldn't just pull out the Mosaic Law and go, oh, we got to kill this guy, got to kill this guy, got to kill this guy kind of attitude. But basically, in the way that it's sort of akin to virtue ethics, again, it's not a form of ethics, but it's similar, is that it's sort of just laying out an ideal way to live. This is what the ideal agent who is a vassal of Yahweh would think like. This is we're describing how justice would look in that sort of setting. So we're not going to give you certain actions necessarily. You can get actions from them, but not all the time. You're supposed to apply the whole wisdom of Proverbs. You're supposed to apply the whole wisdom of the Mosaic Law to know how you ought to live as Yahweh's vassal. And that's similar to virtue ethics in that you don't just follow certain rules. You learn what it is to be a virtuous person and then live that out. So ancient ethics probably ancient forms of ethics are different from a lot of modern forms of ethics, and that their cultural background, they were more sort of describing wisdom, how to live, how to apply wisdom and whatnot. That's very much what Aristotle is sort of doing in the Nicomedean Ethics. He's trying to lay out what it looks like to be a virtuous, what you're supposed to think, how you're supposed to act, not just do A, do B, do C, do E, these kind of things. So it's a little bit more complex. And you can see some similarities with the Mosaic Law, but the Torah is not really laying out ethical laws. It's teaching wisdom in a didactic form, is what I would argue.
So you're not saying, for example, that there are no laws that it's giving you per se to, that, you can't really get any law against anything from them.
Right. You can get stuff from them. I mean, like, love the Lord your God with all your heart. I mean, that's clearly in there. And it's not like like Moses would not be like, this is, not something we should obviously do. That's what he would argue. But, it's about applying wisdom and getting actions. And sometimes, the right thing to do is going to depend on the circumstances. So some people will bring up there are contradictions in the Mosaic Law about, how to act, how to treat slaves. Should they be released 6 years? Should they be made for life? Can you only have Can you only have foreign slaves, or can you have Hebrew slaves? If you understand that it's didactic nature, it's not really laying down laws. It's laying down ways to think. So there are certain stipulations where it talks about, going through your field and leaving some for the poor. Other areas of the Mosaic Law talk about leaving bundles for like the stranger and the sojourn. Okay, well, these aren't really contradictions. It's just trying to teach a general idea that you should take care of the less fortunate. You need to make sure you lay out certain things so they have food to eat. You don't want to leave the stranger, the foreigner, or the poor, these kind of things, or the widow. So that's the general nature of what it's trying to do. It's trying to teach you how to think.
Yeah. And obviously virtue ethics, like any other theory and philosophy, has some objections to it. What do you think of the objection to virtue ethics, that it doesn't really provide agents guidance on what ordinary agents can do to realize virtue, and that it's way too individualistic?
Yeah, that's a good objection, but I do think it's actually one of the strengths of virtue ethics when it comes out. Because we have to understand that the real world is messy. You can't always take a universal law and always apply it to every single circumstance. You got to be intimate with the circumstances. You got to be intimate with who you are as a person. The right thing, if you encounter a burglary, the right thing for a cop to do is going to be different than what an old lady is supposed to do. They have to have knowledge of the situation, knowledge of who they are, and what the right thing they should do can be derived from that. So you got to actually understand the circumstances. So the idea that you should always follow certain rules, it can't always apply. The idea that you should always worry about the consequences can't always apply. I mean, deontologists and consequentialists go back and forth providing scenarios where their form of ethics cannot apply. So deontologists will propose a scenario like the sheriff scenario, where consequentialism sounds like you're going to lead to some sort of ethical problem. Then consequentialists will take scenarios like the axe murderer comes to your house, and they'll throw that at deontologists and say there are some areas where your ethics cannot apply. And virtue ethics say, yeah, that's the point, is that the real world is even more messy than these hypotheticals you're proposing to each other. It's much more complicated. You just can't have these sort of guiding principles or rules that are always going to dictate behavior. Instead, we should understand what a virtuous character is, and then from that, we'll just be a law unto ourselves. We'll know how to act when the circumstances arise. Now, virtue ethics does provide some guidance. Aristotle talks about you'll learn what is noble from noble people. Virtue ethicists have said the way to understand ethics is to learn from an expert. So go back to the analogy of practical skills. I think we would all agree I would far more likely trust a pilot who has been trained by an expert pilot, has had on-the-job experience, versus some guy who said, yeah, I read the instruction manual, we'll be fine. Obviously, we understand that learning from an expert, you're going to better understand the skill. Likewise, one of the things Aristotle and virtue ethicists lay down is that it's best to learn from an actual expert. I believe it's called the phromenos is the Greek term. This virtuous ideal agent. Learn from him, follow him, do what he does, and over time you'll just have the experience. You'll have the knowledge of what it is to be a virtuous person. So virtue ethics does offer some guidance. Learn virtue from the virtuous people. Learn what is noble from noble people. Follow them, learn, so to speak, the skills of virtue, and then you'll know how to act. So I think that's actually one of the strengths of ethics, is that it's not saying that you should always worry about the consequence, or you should always follow certain universal laws. Virtue ethics is a lot more flexible when it comes to the real practical life that we live in and the type of right answers to circumstances. Now, some might say, well, that leads to extreme relativism, but that's not true, because we're trying to figure out what it is to be a virtuous person. There is flexibility, but it's not endless flexibility. That doesn't mean relativism, because there are certain ways you can live virtuous, but there are plenty of ways that you just wouldn't live virtuous. So that doesn't mean the extreme view of relativity or relativism where, to each his own regardless of anything. No, we can still look at like the crackhead and say that's not a virtuous way to live. We can look at somebody who is living a very spoiled life, living like in their mom's basement, just playing video games. We would say they're not living a good, flourishing, virtuous life and they should change. It doesn't imply extreme relativism.
Yeah, that is actually very interesting to think about. Another thing I would always like to bring up to you, we talked about this more in the messenger. You've defended the idea, that there is a link between God and morality. And your approach is you note that morality is essentially relational, and you tie that to God. An objection that I've thought of from my studies to your moral argument for God's existence is that while morality is relational, it doesn't seem that it necessarily requires actual relations to take place. Because we have relational theories of more naturalistic theories of these sort of relations in the case of the ideal observer theory. What do you make of that?
Well, the first thing I want to say is what is the ideal? So if you're going to posit an ideal observer theory, I'm going to ask, well, what is the ideal? Well, the ideal is going to be how to live a certain life. What are the certain actions you got to do in certain circumstances? What is the nature of virtue? This implies a personal aspect. The ideal is going to be personal. It's not going to just be these laws or these certain virtues floating on the ether. When we think about the ideal in normative ethics, we're going to think about an actual agent, the ideal agent. That's what we're going to picture. He's going to know what to do, or she's going to know what to do in every circumstance. She's going to know what it means to be a virtuous person. She's going to know how to live. So I think it just takes you right back to the moral argument, because if you posit there's an ideal in ethics, the way you're going to describe it is going to be personal.
Typically speaking, when ideal observer theorists posit it, they give an analogy to the reasonable person in law. The reasonable person standard in law. Basically, let's say you rob a bank, and they arrest you, and you stand before a trial. They want to convict you beyond a reasonable doubt. And to do that, they invoke a standard known as the rational man standard. Basically, this is this ideal man that's perfectly rational, or at least rational enough to assess the case fairly. And it's accepted that this is a legal fiction. The rational man does not actually exist, but the hypothetical of what said man would do if he did exist does seem to offer a bit of a thing that we can shoot up for. And the ideal observers simply take that, but they apply it to morality.
Right, and I'm perfectly fine with that, but I still think they're going to describe a hypothetical type person. Now, if someone is going to be a moral realist, they're going to say that there actually is real objective moral values and duties. They're going to have to believe that they're actually out there in some sense. And if you're going to describe the ideal of what it is to be ethical, you're going to ultimately be describing an agent, even in the scenario you're describing. So because if you're committed to the idea that morality is real, moral realism, I think when you get to your moral ontology and you're describing what moral values and duties actually are in a real sense, you're going to be describing them in a personal way. And I think that just relates back to the moral argument.
Well, like I said, it's sort of like the hypothetical, and it's sort of like, the ideal observer theory is often accused of being basically a naturalistic form of divine command theory, which, to me, I think there is justification. Some ideal observer theorists do say that there are similarities, but there are distinctions.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, there are.
The divine command theory posits that God exists, and makes commands. Whereas that's not the case with the ideal observer theory. Now, it doesn't go in the opposite direction where it posits God doesn't exist. it's more or less agnostic on it. If I'm reading a philosopher on this as well, as he says perfectly well that, you could, in theory, make God the ideal observer, but it's not a necessary component. You could, do the legal standard sort of thing that we do. And that's what most naturalists that do subscribe to that sort of do. They describe the ideal observer in descriptive psychological terms. And this is sort of a thing like when we think in our mind about when we're doing an action, we think, what would an ideal observer do in this circumstance? That's sort of, and there is some intuitiveness in that, because when we are deliberating on morality, we do often think in ideals, and we think of what would, in fact, in Christianity, people ask, what would Jesus do?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. My only reply to for the ideal observer theory was to be like, the more you're describing this ideal observer, the more likely you're going to want to describe a real actual person, a real actual agent, because you don't want it to be an actual hypothetical. You want to try to apply it as much as you can to a real world circumstance that you're in. And it makes more sense to apply to a real actual agent, someone we could follow and learn from and be guided by. And I think that's a far more rational stance than just this sort of hypothetical collection of values or laws in that sense. And I think this is one of the things, I think, the strengths of Christian virtue ethics, is that we were given the ideal agent to actually follow. We don't have to worry or hypothesize what he would actually be like. We were actually given that in Christian virtue ethics.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Now, we talk a lot about hypothetical scenarios, and in my talk with you on Messenger, you notoriously hate, all these moral scenarios that philosophers give each other. And you base that on your virtue ethical stance. Many would say that, projecting sort of moral scenarios might be a bit limiting in, establishing morality. What would you think about that?
I mean, I would agree to that to a certain extent. I think it can help us shape our understanding of ethics, but it cannot help understand what actions we should take. So trolley scenarios can give us a better understanding of what ethics is, but it should not be directing action. It should not be telling us how we ought to act in the real world. So in an upcoming video I'll do on virtue ethics, I'm going to use one of Bernard Williams' analogy, where this guy named Jim goes to South America and he's asked to kill one native, so that 19 others are spared. I think these analogies are fine to help us understand what ethics is and shortcomings in certain ethical theories, but I don't think we should be using those scenarios to guide action.
Yeah. I mean, a perfect thing that I often find is, if you want to know a fun fact, because I actually did read up a bit on, some sociologists, some psychologists and stuff, they like to, when they're trying to test, how we think about morality, they posit the trolley situation, and they actually found a funny thing that there is a bit of a gender bias when it comes to it. People are much more willing to sacrifice a man to the than they are a woman. And,
right, I think that relates into our study of psychology, and we feel that women should be more protected than men. It's just the way humans tend to think.
Yeah. So what's funny is that applies, you would think men would be a bit biased in their own self-interest, where they say, oh no, get the woman, but actually no, men in some cases are actually higher than the women when it comes to, push the man and do the trolley on the guy, not the woman. So I always just found that sort of thing funny when you go into the psychology. You would think there would be an in-group bias with men, but it doesn't. In some cases, it seems like to be the exact opposite.
Right.
Now, we did talk about this a bit more, in the first question, and you talked about Dilbert Hillers and how things worked out in terms of commands. or how the educational merits of the Old Testament. But there does seem to be times in the Old Testament where God is making commands to people, like to behave and do a certain action, like old Canaanite situation, and like where God's saying, chase them out of their land and do stuff like that. How would you frame that within virtue ethics, and how would you make how do you relate it to some more of the harsher parts of the Bible in general?
Well, again, virtue ethics is not opposed to actions. We understand that actions is a very important part of ethics. And so if the ideal agent is saying this is the right thing to do, we would understand that that is the right thing to do. Like Jesus says, go and make disciples. We understand that that's the job of the church. He can give certain commands. And Aristotle also notes there are certain actions that are just, we can still derive universal rules from virtue ethics. So, for example, at one point, let me pull up the quote here. He says, there are certain actions that could just never flow from a virtuous character. So we can know, for example, that it's always wrong to rape. It's universally wrong to rape because that could never flow from a virtuous character. Aristotle says, but not every action or feeling admits of a mean, for some have names immediately connected with depravity, such as spite, shamelessness, envy, and among actions, adultery, theft, and homicide. All these and others like them are so called because they themselves, and not their excesses or deficiencies, are bad. So in their case, then, one can never hit the mark but always misses. So you can still sort of get actions from virtue ethics because you could it's always wrong to torture an innocent life. It's always wrong to rape. It's always wrong to commit adultery. These kind of things. So in that sort of sense, going back to the question you gave, it's that you could say that in those certain circumstances, the right action was known based on the virtues that were given and the guidance that the virtuous ideal agent laid out.
What do you make of sort of the evolutionary stories that, like they call, funny enough, evolutionary stories, where atheists will, try to give a sort of evolutionary explanation for how we came about to get our morality, and they would say, well, you can just explain morality basically on evolution. What's your sort of thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's confusing evolution. That's confusing like moral psychology with moral ontology or metaethics or whatever field we're talking about. So, for example, we evolved to understand science, but that doesn't mean science is our social construct. We evolved to have a means to discover and study the natural world. Science is just not a social construct. Likewise, just because we evolved to understand morality, that doesn't mean that's all morality is. They're confusing psychology with ontology or metaethics or normative ethics, whatever the subject they're talking about.
Well, I would say it more confuses like how we came to know something with what that thing is.
Right, and that's basically what I'm saying.
Yeah. I remember, at least in the case of rape, a common evolutionary reason why humans have a very bad distaste for it is the fact that it really poses a challenge to parental, like what they call it, male certainty of fatherhood. Like, for example, if a man would rape another man's wife, which was considered adultery in the Bible, what made that bad is not just that it sort of challenged the honor of the man, of the husband.
Are you still there? I think you're breaking up a little bit. I can't hear you.
Yeah, I said.
Yeah, you're still breaking up. I'm not getting anything.
Yeah, train station.
Oh. Right. Yeah. But wait, so I lost my train of thoughts. Where were we at?
Man raping another man's wife.
Yeah, that was considered.
I'm not.
The other together. What happens is that
I'm sorry, I'm still not hearing anything. You're
How
coming
long
through
is
like
that train?
yeah, I'm not getting anything.
can you mute your mic until the thing comes by, Carlos? All right. So yeah, basically, it's the idea that the reason why rape was considered wrong is the fact that it called into question the paternity of the father. I mean, of the husband.
Yeah, and I understand where that's coming from, but just because we have a distaste for something, it doesn't mean it's that's all that ethics is. So, for example, you can think of like taste preferences. We could say that humans are designed to eat certain things and not want to eat certain things. But when we come across somebody who's got like some sort of weird issue where they want to eat like couch cushions or styrofoam, we don't think they're doing anything ethically wrong. We just think they're doing something bad for their health. We would say, when someone says, they, when people have different diets, like vegan versus like, a paleo type diet, we don't think they're violating some sort of ethical rule there. We would just say that, they have different preferences. So just because we have preferences and you could see ethics could correlate to that doesn't mean that's all ethics is. Rape transcends mere preferences. There's something wrong about it beyond our mere preferences that we acknowledge.
Yeah. Well, I got my questions out of the way pretty good. What are some questions that you'd like to give him, Carlos?
Yeah, speaking of the Old Testament, how would you go about explaining a normal person who, or just any person in general who has trouble discerning, the morality of the Old Testament? Things were hard. Many people are caught off guard about how harsh the Old Testament times were compared to our time. Those who don't study history very much.
Yeah, so one of the things I say is I remind them that there's something happening in the Bible called the Degradation Theory. That from Adam up till Moses, there's like this degradation process. That's what's one of the themes of Genesis 1-11 is that humans just keep getting worse. So if we understand that humans got so bad they couldn't understand the ethics that per se Adam and Eve had, that God could just not give them a perfect moral code right away and they would live a hunky-dory life. We understand when people have progressed to that point, you sort of help them along, get them to a better place first. You give them certain compromises that they work with, and then they move up. So God is working with human societies to get them to a better ethical place. The Mosaic Law is not perfect. It contains compromises. This is what we see in places like Matthew 19, 1 Samuel 8, Numbers 23. God is sort of setting certain rules in place that fit for the cultural context of the time, but they're not meant to last. They're meant to be replaced or be fulfilled in a more perfect law to come, namely the law of the New Testament, the ethical framework there. So I would remind people that that's basically one of the aspects of Scripture that's sort of unfolding over time.
Yeah, I definitely think, what you seem to be describing is sort of like Michael Heiser's view of like a back to Eden ethics.
Right.
Where basically, God's trying to bring us back to the state we were with Adam and Eve. A little bit better because we fell away from that.
Yeah, I would definitely say that's kind of what's going on in the Bible, is that it's sort of like a return to Eden kind of aspect, that the fall happened, which we fell away from God and we kept falling away further. This is something I talk about in my Genesis 1-11 series. I talk about how Cain was worse than Adam, and then his descendants got even worse and worse, and so by the time you get to Babel, God just sort of divorces the nations and tries to start over with Abraham and Isaac, and so this is a slow progression back that we're still going through, I would argue. Starts with Abraham, Moses takes us to a better place, and the prophets come, expand upon that. And then, of course, Christ comes and offers the new covenant, which has, of course, been the best step forward at that point. I don't know if there's anything else that needs to be added after that. It's just God sanctifying us beyond that at this point.
Yeah, I do. Like a typical thing that people often complain about in the Old Testament is the use of corporate punishment, where basically you punish a group of people for what, like let's say one person did. Like for example, the Pharaoh. They'll say that God took out his anger with the Pharaoh onto the people, and killed the firstborns. And people will talk about generational curses, where you'll get down to like 10 generations of all being cursed. So what do you really make of that sort of thing?
I mean, one thing to remember is I do believe there in something we tend to forget is there are sins connected. I mean, our sins don't just affect us; they affect everyone around us. And so I think with that, it's a very complicated issue. It has more to do with collective responsibility and using the Egyptians' own laws against them, showing them the problem of what the precedent they had set, and God is using their own rules against them to destroy them in that sort of sense. Now, I don't have a lot of time to expand upon that, but there's a lot more there than what just meets the eye.
We got time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the things is that it's sort of playing on what sort of happened with the Israelite boys being thrown into the Red Sea. You've destroyed the firstborn males. You've set this precedent, and you won't listen to me. So and you think you're in charge. Well, since you think you're in charge, I'm gonna use your own rules against you. I'll take the firstborn from you, so that hopefully you'll now listen and whatnot. So that's definitely something being at play there. Another aspect of virtue ethics is the idea that you cannot just sort of sin or do something wrong or do something good in a vacuum. Everything you do is going to affect those around you, and that's also being at play at this collective responsibility aspect.
Yeah. A common sort of thing that I would hear from some people that are more literate on the ancient cultures is that the Bible claims that God made the Jews distinct from the pagan nations, but yet the Jews still carried over a lot of traditions from the pagans. Like, for example, not just Jews refused to eat pork. That was also a thing that the Egyptians did. They didn't eat pork either.
And circumcision and many other things.
Yeah, and so a lot of people will say, well, so what does it really mean for the people of for the Jews to be separate from the pagan nations when they share so much culturally?
I don't think we should call them Jews because they weren't really Jews until after the United Kingdom divided.
Well, I'm using it
The
as a
ones in the
short.
South, but Israelites were.
I know, I'm using it more as a shorthand.
Yeah, there were definitely aspects that carried over there, like the idea of uh, the Ark of the Covenant is very much an Egyptian theme. Now, I do think there is some evidence that the Egyptians did eat pork. I know Donald Redford has written a little bit about that. So it may not be entirely the case, but that was not their favorite thing to eat. Obviously, their favorite thing to eat was cow. So that was there is evidence of pig bones throughout Egypt, just not nearly as much.
Yeah. Um, you know, so I always did find that interesting because there was a lot of carryover. I was saying, what does it really mean? I always like to say what God meant by the Jews and the pagans were separate is not so much that they had vastly different cultures. It was more that God offered them a theological framework that they could carry out these virtuous actions under that they didn't have previously.
Mm-hmm.
What do you speaking about the Old Testament ethics, you might call it? What do you make of the Greg Boyd view of things?
Greg Boyd. I don't know if I've read a lot of his stuff, so I would
The
need to.
crucifixion of the warrior god.
I need.
What?
I don't know. I need you to explain it to me because I don't know if I've read his stuff.
Basically, the main theme of his book explains how the ancient Israelites tended to project their own ideals onto God, and before they got more theologically sophisticated over time.
I mean, I think
you know how God was portrayed as the great god of thunder and storm, and that personifies the divine warrior.
Yeah, I feel like that's just something that all humans do, is that we always want to try to, I mean, our paintings we paint, God the Father is like this big old man in the sky, and, he doesn't actually have a physical body. I just think that's
I don't
something
know
all
anybody
humans.
ever actually thought that, though.
Yeah,
Except,
well, I mean,
Except the Mormons and village atheists.
yeah.
well, except the Indians.
Ah,
They had the great Sky Daddy.
nah. Anyway, during the scientific revolution, when they portrayed God as this great architect and wanted to imitate God by uncovering the revelations of his blueprint.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there does seem to be an element to the evolution, at least. So is there any other questions that you want to ask him as well? Carlos?
I had one, but I lost my train of thought.
Yeah, a common thing that obviously there is a lot of hot button political and well, not, I would say they're ethical, not necessarily political. Depends on your perspective on it, but like obviously same-sex marriage, that's one, and the abortion issue. Do you think virtue ethics can really apply to political situations?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think it can. I think that's the way that we ought to live. So, and politics is an aspect of the way we live. So, you should definitely apply it there. So, of course, I can't give any. It'd be hard to give me certain scenarios, but I think politics just sort of comes out of the way humans sort of organize themselves. And so, if we organize ourselves around virtue ethics, politics would just follow naturally from that.
Yeah, I definitely think. Although, would virtue ethicists distinguish between legality and morality?
It depends. I mean, that's another thing. It's like it's hard to put all that into certain circumstances. We would obviously say there are some things that are illegal versus things that are ethical. Like I would say, I don't think I want adultery outlawed. I think people should have the right to make that sort of choice, even though I think it's immoral. I don't think people should actually live that way. But I don't agree with
Just
the
that the
polyamorous
adulterer should be
lifestyle.
publicly shamed for it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't agree with the lifestyle of polyamorous. I don't think that's a virtuous way to live. I don't think humans should live that way. But I don't think it should be outlawed. So I think there's obviously a distinction there. People sometimes forget that when they're talking about what is the ethical or what certain laws we should have.
Yeah, I mean, a common thing is, like, I like to give the example, is that we generally all agree that lying for no good reason is wrong, but would we seriously want the government arresting every person on every single moment that they told a lie for no good reason?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, so there does seem to be, I would always like to say, in terms of legality, it's moral principles plus economic pragmatism. Like, arresting everybody that tells tells lies for no good reason would be, for one, sort of unfeasible to do, because you're going to be arresting a lot of people and you don't have the manpower to do that.
Well,
Two, even assuming you could do it, you're really going to be wasting a lot of resources to pull it off.
Well, the big tech, our big tech overlords are trying to do that already by censoring misinformation, quote unquote. Basically, anything they deem to be a lie.
I mean, personally, there is, of course, the part of me that says, well, they're a private company. But on the other hand, I also do see the argument from the other side and saying, well, yes, they're a private company, but they're also being commanded by the government.
Well, I think the other side issue is that they claim to be a platform. not a publisher. So there's a difference between it. If you claim to be a platform, you're supposed to platform anyone. So you like your phone company is a platform. It'd be weird if you're talking to your mom about your political views and all of a sudden your phone company interrupted and said, we don't like you sharing those ideas, we're going to cut you off. Well, no, you're a platform. You're not supposed to publish certain things. You're just supposed to platform other people. So if Facebook claims to be a platform, that's the legality issue that the other side is making.
I think that's certainly an issue that I think, like, I basically think we need to decide whether or not, like, is Facebook and these big tech, are they publishers or are they platforms?
Well, they're publishers. They're de facto public squares that are essentially publishers.
Yeah, it should be, like, settled because it's really because it's sort of like in limbo at the moment.
And it favors one political party and it's discriminatory, partisan.
To me, I honestly don't go entirely into that with, it also censors socialist, funny enough, and some communist.
Only when they go far even by their standards.
Well, I mean, the thing is like, I always find it is that, obviously, YouTube and all of these big tech companies, they're really into it for one reason, and that's to make money. And if you espouse views that they think that they're going to lose money off of, whether you happen to be on the left or the right, or conservative or liberal, socialist, communist, or whatever, they're going to have an incentive to kick you off.
And to control people.
Yeah. To me, my more problem with it is that they're not even consistent with their own layout. Like, I could understand, like, if they don't really tell you what you did wrong. It would be one thing, like, let's say I cursed a lot in a video, and they said, hey, we're trying to make it more kid-friendly. Could you limit the F-bomb to maybe 1 or 2?
Yeah, and they allow the sexualization of kids, and if they didn't have double standards, they wouldn't have standards at all.
Yeah. But yeah, that's sort of what I go into when it comes to politics and morality. There does seem to be, things that we should. I definitely think that there are limitations in how we cross over into both of them.
Yeah, that's not really my subject, so I don't really know a lot about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was trying to tie it more back to politics and stuff like that, and morality. Just more or less to give a distinction between the two.
Oh yeah, and do you also think that you agree with separation of church and state in principle, or have people gone too far with that?
I'm not. Again, it depends on the circumstances. I don't know what that means. It depends on the court case. I think the federal government is set up to be some sort of secular, but I think the original Constitution allowed for states to decide religious views. So states, I believe, according to the original understanding of the Constitution, was that local governments could have religious governmental stipulations or procedures, but not the federal government. And that was because a lot of the denominations were fighting back then over who should be in charge.
Well, that and the fact that they fought a revolutionary war against a place that had a nationalized church.
Yeah, and that was a problem.
Yeah, it still is a problem in some places because I think personally that when you have a major nationalized religion, you sort of tie politics with the religion itself. And once politics goes south, and the religion goes south as well.
Mm-hmm.
American civic
That's
religion.
why you can see a lot of these formerly very religious places, like in Denmark, Sweden, the rest, they became non-religious very quickly.
That's also a lot of that's also because of communism. Like in Germany, for instance, you see West Germany is more Christian, and East Germany is more atheist because they have a history of communism that's still seeped into the psyche of people there. Same with the Czech Republic and other places. While others, like Hungary and Romania, are rooting out secularism.
Yeah. I mean, anyway, another thing is a common trend is like, you go over the idea of moral progression and how intuitive it is. Now, some people would make the argument that it's not as intuitive as we think it is because, it does seem to be a byproduct of cultures like Christianity, where Christianity, because it teaches, that you'll be saved, like, well, not saved, but there'll be a second coming and stuff like that. And Christianity gave a much different account of time than the pagans did. To the pagans, for example, like Christians see time as a linear, you're just going forward. Well, in pagan theology, everything goes into a cycle.
Yeah, that's very much Stoic philosophy as well. The cycle of the universe back and forth. Destruction, creation, destruction, creation.
That's why funny enough, if you look through the ancient Greek pagans, you'll find that they were very pessimistic about, even in times where they were prosperous, they were very pessimistic because they said, oh yeah, we're prosperous right now, just wait a couple years and we're going to be destroyed.
Yeah, I mean, it is definitely moral perfection is definitely more of a Christian idea, but I don't think it's entirely that. It does seem like it's you can find it in a secular aspect as well, like ideas in the Geneva Convention. We've come to a much better world by having things like that versus like the ancient Roman world of crucifixion and whatnot. So you can say that there are cycles and whatnot, but over time we have gotten better as making perhaps a society or human species together.
Yeah, a common thing that a common objection I find to deontologists is that rules and laws seem to be ad hoc. Not ad hoc, but they come after the fact. Basically, what happens is you have virtuous agents acting, and basically what they do is once they've been doing something for a while, they simply summarize it in these rules. So that's a typical thing I hear of virtue ethicists when they are challenging deontologists. They say, look, you're behaving virtuously prior to making these rules. It's more like of an ad hoc thing. Like, first people are moral in themselves, and they're acting virtuous, and then they summarize what they're doing into laws.
Right, and that makes more sense, I feel like. We understand we have to be a virtuous person, and then we can come up with general principles that can apply in certain circumstances. Sometimes we should worry about the consequences of our actions. Sometimes there are certain rules that we need to follow regardless of the circumstance. Like, it's always going to be wrong to rape. Things like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously a virtuous aid, like a common thing that people will say that you look to virtuous, agents of your own time. Like, for example, you would look at Gandhi, Mother Teresa. You would look at all these moral agents and you would say, well, obviously they're not perfect, but they do seem to exemplify certain virtues.
Mm-hmm.
And you can learn from them and you can get an approximation of the right actions you should do in your life.
Yeah, and that's kind of what it is. It's like we can see these virtuous agents and we want to exemplify that. That tends to be how humans tend to think about what is the right way to live. We tend to look to virtuous agents. That is a much better way to do ethics than to just sort of find principles and think those can apply to every certain circumstance, or find laws, think those can apply to every circumstance. Instead, it's better to learn and see how other people have acted, learn from their mistakes, and learn from what they did right.
Yeah, another thing that I've seen when virtuous are battling utilitarians. All right, you need to take off soon. Yeah, well, I'm gonna make one more question, and we can wrap it up. I know one sort of objection that virtue ethicists like a common objection that they give to consequentialism and just basically utilitarianism is that it tends to be very collectivist, and you do have there is some sense where you're ignoring individual suffering for the sake of the masses. And that doesn't really seem like something a virtuous agent would do. They would, like, obviously they would want to minimize the damage, but they wouldn't completely ignore individual suffering.
Yeah, I think that applies more to consequentialism than deontology, perhaps. One of the issues I think with deontology is it's sort of this this fetishizing of laws. I'm going to do the right thing because the law says I have to, not because it's the right, not because I want to be a good person. So if I had a family member who was down, and maybe there's a universal law that I have to cheer them up. Well, I'm cheering them up because I'm following a law. I'm not doing it because I really want to help them. And so that would say that's more of a problem for deontology, is this fetishizing of laws. Instead, we should focus on what it is to be a good person, to be a good virtuous person, and then the right actions will follow.
Yeah, and and also basically many virtue ethicists take advice from Kant when he criticized utilitarianism, and he said, like he gave the examples of, someone is at your door and they want, a prisoner, or they want like you're hiding someone in your basement or something, and whether or not you should lie or tell the truth in that circumstance. Kant, said you should, even in that circumstance, you shouldn't lie because the consequences are always uncertain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he talks about that. Yeah, just shut the door on them type of thing.
Well, it's sort of like this. Like, we obviously intuitively think, yeah, you should lie. Like, these people want to hurt the person that you're hiding.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, Kant brings up the fact that, what if, you lie to them and they say, all right, well, have a nice day, sir. And then they do is they turn around and they find out that, there's places where more of the people that they're looking for, and that happened because you rejected them.
But that entails intent.
Yeah, so I mean, so the thing is that that's a sort of thing that virtue ethicists critique consequentialism on, is that they rely a lot on, measuring the consequences, but the consequences always do seem to be like uncertain.
Yeah, that is a problem, we would say. But consequences, we would say, is just not all actions. We need to focus also on certain rules that can guide our actions, but we need to focus on virtues primarily to derive those rules. So the idea is that we're not saying that deontology or consequentialist views are wrong. We're saying they're just incomplete. There's more to ethics than merely guiding actions.
All right. Well,
All right,
we have gone on long enough. Would you like to?
Yeah. Tell me your what future projects you're working on, and
So I have a video coming out probably in September, titled "Is Christianity Anti-Science?" where I'll be going over some studies on biases among scientists against religion and whatnot. I'll be doing a series on virtue ethics, some more on Old Testament archaeology, and then hopefully by next summer I'm gonna do a series on the documentary hypothesis.
When are you gonna redo your Exodus documentary?
Probably March.
Oh,
That'd be good. And also I heard that you're going to be having a discussion with Dr. Falk on
in a couple days. Yeah.
Yeah. So, obviously I'm going to recommend people to go check that out when it comes out. It should be a blast. But yeah, it was great to have you on, Michael, and talk about to talk about virtue ethicists. I don't think you've gone in an interview and went into this much in depth in virtue ethics.
Yeah, I'm going to be doing probably 2 or 3 videos on virtue ethics later this year, where I'll be able to go very much in depth.
All right. Well, like I said, it was nice having you on, good sir.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks for having me, guys.
your audience, you know what to do.